It is so nice to have this together. You can hear that this meeting is now being recorded. And I want to just introduce myself and introduce our speaker. Welcome to all of you. Like the recorded voice just said, this meeting will be recorded, is being recorded. I'm Rabbi Zoe Klein-Miles, and I'm the Director of Adult Education and Engagement at Temple Isaiah. Temple Isaiah is a congregation in West Los Angeles, if you're just joining us for the first time. And we are known as your home at the intersection of innovation and tradition. We are a community dedicated to pursuing social justice, bettering our community, city, nation, and world by building bridges and deepening relationships and connections with all peoples, and to ongoing lifelong education. I want to really thank our congregant Gail Gottesman for initiating this idea, bringing this topic to our attention, and introducing me to Josh Coleman and making this happen. So thank you so much, Gail. Dr. Coleman is a psychologist in private practice in the San Francisco Bay Area and a senior fellow with the Council on Contemporary Families, a nonpartisan organization of leading sociologists, historians, psychologists, and demographers dedicated to providing the press and public with the latest research and best practice findings about American families. He's written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, NBC Think, The Behavioral Scientist, CNN, Market Watch, the San Francisco Chronicle, Greater Good Magazine, Huffington Post, Psychology Today, and more. He's given talks to the faculties at Harvard, the Weill Cornell Department of Psychiatry, and other academic institutions. And he's a frequent guest on the Today Show and NPR. He has Today Show and NPR. He has also been featured on Sesame Street, interesting, 2020, Good Morning America, PBS, America Online Coaches, and a number of news programs for Fox, ABC, CNN, and NBC television. So we're so happy that you have made time for our community as well. Josh Coleman is also the author of numerous articles and chapters and has written 4 books. His newest is The Rules of Engagement: Why Adult Children Cut Ties and How to Heal the Conflict. He is co-editor along with historian Stephanie Kuntz of 7 online volumes of unconventional wisdom, news you can use, a compendium of noteworthy research on the contemporary family, gender, sexuality, poverty, and work-family issues. And I'm going to be posting in the chat. I'm going to post it now, but I'm also going to post it later on as well in case you miss it. I'm going to post Josh Coleman's website upon which he has free question and answer time on Mondays, and also 2 articles by Dr. Coleman. A Shift in American Family Values is Fueling Estrangement. That's the first one, and another one on estrangement, as well as a website for a training program for therapists, clergy, and coaches, and a link to purchase his book. So you'll see those appear in the chat in just a moment. And it is really my pleasure, all of our pleasure, to welcome Dr. Coleman. Throughout this talk, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I will be curating those questions and presenting them to Dr. Coleman after his presentation. Thank you so much and welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be speaking to you, Rabbi, and to your community, and to people who came through other communities. It's such an important topic, and one of the things that I've discovered through my work is, it really feels like estrangement is a silent epidemic. And I say that it's a silent epidemic because most of the people who are going through it feel such a sense of shame and social isolation that they don't really talk about it. And then when they start to talk about it, then they know other people that they can form communities with, such as I have on my website and the like. So it's a much bigger problem in our culture, in our society, than most people know about. So I'm always grateful to be able to address larger groups of people like your community, Rabbi. So one of the things that I've learned, and as Rabbi Zoe said, I'm a psychologist in private practice. So my practice has really been in many ways taken over by the topic of parental estrangement. Probably at this point, 3/4 of the people that I see are estranged parents, estranged grandparents. I also do family work with reconciling between the estranged adult children and the parents. And really, these are the most heartbroken people in the world. These are parents and grandparents whose children want nothing to do with them. Here's some quotes that I hear on a daily basis. If I get sick during the pandemic, will my son break his 4 years of silence and contact me? Or am I just going to die alone? How am I supposed to live with this kind of pain if I never see my daughter again? My grandchildren and I were so close, and this estrangement has nothing to do with them. Do my grandchildren think I abandoned them or that I don't love them? Here's another. I wasn't invited to my son's graduation from college or his wedding. Now I heard his wife is pregnant. We used to be so close. So these are the kind of things that I hear on a daily basis. When I first started doing this work, I really struggled to know how to help these parents. And so I had to really dig deeper into our culture to understand, why is this happening, and how to help people who are going through this. So my interest, and you'll discover if you've read my book, which I have very subtly illustrated behind the rules of estrangement, is that my interest in this began personally. I was married and divorced in my early 20s, and I have a daughter who's now 40, who I'm currently very close to, but there was a period of time in her early 20s where she cut off contact for several years with me, in large part because of my remarrying and having children from my second marriage, and in many ways feeling displaced by my remarriage. And so there were several years where we didn't talk at all, not because I didn't want to. And it was easily the most painful, awful, disorienting thing that I ever went through and ever hoped to go through again. And eventually I was able to reconcile with her basically by learning how to be more empathic, how to take responsibility, how to find the kernel of truth in what she was saying, how to show empathy, all the things that I teach the estranged parents in my practice. And so I wrote my first book on the topic, When Parents Hurt, 12 years ago, to help parents who needed help with this topic. And as a result of that book, I developed an international following, really, of estranged parents from all over the world, primarily in the US and the UK, but really Israel as well, Australia, who are struggling with this issue. And I also started a regular Tuesday night webinar series for estranged parents, because people were so hungry for all these different aspects of estrangement, all the different ways that it manifests itself. And because I got so many emails on a daily basis, and my Jewish guilt was preventing me from being able to feel good about not being able to answer them all because there were so many, I formed a free Monday Q&A that has continued to this day. It's about 10 years old. So every Monday at 11:30 a.m. Pacific, I answer questions from estranged parents. And you can, if you're interested in that, you can, if you register on my website for my free newsletter, you can get the links to that. And I also have a website for a private website for estranged parents and grandparents, a Facebook site. So I'm just saying that in terms of the community building aspect of this. So because of all of the families that I've worked with and counseled and estranged, not only estranged parents, but estranged adult children, I feel like I've really developed a very granular look at what's causing this problem. And I also recently conducted a survey through the University of Wisconsin Survey Center of 1,600 estranged parents. That's going to be coming out in a few peer-reviewed academic articles in the next, hopefully in the next couple of months. So what I'd like to do is start with kind of a 10,000 feet up perspective. Why is estrangement happening? Is it on the rise? If it's on the rise, why is it on the rise? And from there, I want to kind of drill down more deeply into some common pathways to estrangement. And I'm going to plug in my computer, which I forgot to do. And occasionally when I do that, my computer goes offline for a second. So if it does that, I will come right back. Don't go anywhere.
We will fill the time waiting for you to come back.
Okay, thank you. And we're good. Okay, you're still there, right? Yeah, okay, good. So one of the questions I get the most is, hasn't there always been estrangement? Is estrangement truly on the rise? And I believe the answer is yes, it is on the rise. And this was a topic of a recent article in The Atlantic that I wrote called "A Change in Family Values is Fueling Estrangement." And one of the ways to think about it is a quote from the historian Stephanie Kuntz, who wrote an important book called The Way We Never Were. And what Kuntz says is that marriage has changed more in the past 30 years than it did in the prior 3,000 years. And what she means by that is that the institutions that guided family life, really for several thousand years, have gone under a radical transformation in general in the past half century. And those things, from my perspective, fuel a rise in estrangement. The institutions that guided family life, such as sex roles, the importance of religion as a guiding force, neighborhood, the ethos around honoring thy mother and thy father, respecting thy elders, has largely given way to a preoccupation and a focus on personal happiness and personal growth. So given these constraints, contact with parents today becomes much less motivated by a sense of obligation or duty as it did in the past, however problematic that might have been. It wasn't like, things were perfect in the past. We can't get too nostalgic. But by the way the adult child feels about the relationship, by the way that the relationship with the parent makes the adult child feel about themselves. So a common question that an adult child might ask might be, well, does my parent limit my potential? Do they limit or constrain my happiness, my distinctiveness? What does it say about me to stay in contact with them? What kind of a person does that make me if I'm in contact with them? What kind of a person does that make me if I reject my parents and cut off contact with them? So prior to, say, the 1960s or the 1970s, cutting off, the idea of cutting off a parent was considered, in many ways, a fairly objectively bad thing to do. Whereas today, estrangement is considered much more an act of growth. So yes, there's always been estrangement, but really this is the first time that cutting off a parent can be linked to an act of autonomy and pursuing one's happiness and one's individuality, where the prevailing sentiment can become lose your parent and find yourself. So in many ways, the moral framework that's guided our family life for much of our history has really undergone an enormous transformation, where the moral framework is much more an orientation towards personal happiness, personal growth, and personal fulfillment. And those parents who aren't able to recognize that shift, as I'll talk about this in much more detail in a little bit, are much more vulnerable to an estrangement when an estrangement begins to occur. Estrangements often don't start out, which is the door slamming, I'm never going to talk to you again. Sometimes they do, but more often they start out with kind of a gradual eroding of the relationship for a variety of reasons. So this idea of lose your parent, find yourself is, for example, I heard a young man say, well, in regard to cutting off his mother, I've just become clear I don't need the stress. He was a 28-year-old graduate of an Ivy League school. Since I've been in therapy, I'm learning to surround myself with people who don't make me feel guilty about not being around as much as, make me feel guilty about my not being around as much as they want me to. My mom's really needy, and I just don't need that in my life. So, if he were to go on to a forum today, he would get enormous support for that kind of ideation. So part of what we're witnessing, and this has been fairly well done, is rising rates of individualism in the past 3 or 4 decades in particular. Individualism is constituted by the notion of a preoccupation with personal happiness, with growth, with identity, etc. It used to be the child's job to earn the parents' love. Now it's seemingly the other way around, and parents don't assume that they're going to necessarily have that love. We saw the rise of what Sharon Hayes referred to as intensive motherhood, Annette LaRoe referred to as concerted cultivation, the idea that parents should be It began with the middle class, but now it's percolated into all of the classes. The idea that a parent's job is to really outfit their children with a very strong sense of self-esteem and entitlement and wherewithal and individuality. And if parents don't do that in terms of the reflection of the child later in life, then they can be accused of not having done a good job or having done it right, and that being considered a reason for estrangement. We see rising rates of tribalism in identity politics, which is not a surprise to anybody. A recent article that I wrote for the Behavioral Scientist was about what I learned working with estranged families in terms of how we could potentially solve our differences in the tribal politics that exists. So now, as an example, the Pew Research Center found that political differences is now the single most important determinant of how people evaluate other people. So, I think 5-6 years ago, I don't think I had anybody in my practice who was estranged over political differences, but now I have a lot of people in my practice who are estranged over political differences. Typically, one side are pro-Trump, the other side are anti-Trump. The generations, it could be either generation that feels that. The internet and social media allow groups to form that can encourage estrangement and support it. They call them no contact groups, where there is enormous social support for the idea that cutting off my parents was the best thing that I ever did. So why am I going on about the social aspect? Well, because estrangement is a social phenomenon. When we witness in a society, it's a profound shift in family values and how we think of family, how we think of individuality, how we think about the meaning of conflict in a family. That is really at heart of what's causing estrangement. So, my feeling about estrangement is similar to my feeling about divorce. My feeling about divorce is, well, particularly with children, is that I'll work as a therapist to do everything in my power for there not to be a divorce with children, because I know how hard it is, not only on the children, but on the parents. But I also know the research that shows that sometimes it's better for everybody if parents do divorce. Similarly with estrangement, particularly if the parents aren't really willing and able to make amends to the adult children, take responsibility for ways that they were hurtful to the adult child, then there are cases where estrangement is certainly understandable. Whether it's justified is a different word, but it's certainly understandable. So as a way to drill down into this, I'd like to look at some of the common pathways, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about the common pathways. Most people feel like, oh, your kid doesn't talk to you anymore. You must have done something pretty darn terrible to make that happen. And the reality is that, sure, those cases do exist. And if you look at what estranged adult children say, the majority say that it was either physical abuse, emotional abuse. Differences in values are the ones that are the most common. So certainly a long history of physical abuse between a parent and a child would certainly seem like an understandable reason that somebody may no longer want to talk to a parent. Emotional abuse is trickier, because there's an important study done by Nick Haslam, who's an Australian psychologist. And what Haslam found was that there's been what he calls a concept creep that's occurred over the past 3 decades, where what we used to be considered dysfunctional behavior, trauma, harm, abuse, neglect, wasn't even on the diagnostic radar three decades ago. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that we therapists use and psychiatrists use to bill insurance companies for our clients, where we have to have a diagnosis. Originally in 1943, they had 47 diagnoses. Today, or at least in the DSM-4, which is not even the newest one, there are 300. So there's been an enormous expansion in terms of what we consider to be abusive, traumatizing, harmful, or neglectful behavior. Now, on the one hand, that's a good thing, because that gives people who have been genuinely abused or harmed, a way to talk about it and advocate for themselves. It gives them a language to advocate for themselves and to push for a change, and to, you know, sometimes hopefully explain to people who've hurt them the ways that they did feel hurt or harmed or neglected or abused or traumatized. The problem is that so much of what gets called harm, abuse, trauma, and neglect today are things that I would not consider to be harmful, abusive, or traumatic behavior. Might consider it obnoxious, controlling, difficult, etc. And now, why is this important? Well, it's important because a lot of adult children justify the estrangement on the basis of saying that they were traumatized by the parent, or they abused them, and therefore they owe the parent nothing. Now, whether or not that kind of equation, you know, is the right way to think about family, I'll leave you to decide. But one of the ways to think about it, there's a brilliant Israeli sociologist, Eva Illouz, I-L-L-O-U-C, if you're interested in this topic. And she has a quote that I love, and she says, "Today, our lives are imploded backwards. We look at our lives viewing them backwards. What's a dysfunctional family? It's a family where your needs weren't met. How do you know your needs weren't met? By looking at your present condition." Now, why is that an important quote? Because it reveals the way that we've adopted therapeutic narratives to define our lives. We assume, and our children, adult children assume, that that the problems that they have in adulthood, if they have anxiety, depression, difficulties with relationships, money, attachments, etc., well, all you have to do is look back on your childhood experiences and it'll all be revealed. You'll look at if you just can uncover the traumas that you experienced, then it'll all be revealed. And sure, that happens. I'm a psychologist. I'm trained in trauma work. I would be the last one to say that traumas don't exist. Of course they exist. But not everything that gets called a trauma is a trauma. And a lot of parents are being estranged today by therapists calling things traumas that aren't traumas. It isn't just parents that cause adults to become adults. It's also genetics. It's also class. It's also neighborhood. It's also siblings. It's also good luck. It's also bad luck. So this idea that parents are the ones who are, you know, the ones who are the most responsible for how their children turn out. And if their children turned out with problems, well, then the adult child owes the parent nothing, I think is a kind of a problematic way to run a family and to run a society. Now, this is where my field comes in, and they kind of mess things up. We therapists have become the new high priests, providing moral legitimacy decisions about who to keep or lose in one's life. We call invested parents narcissists or emotionally incestuous or codependent. We provide a kind of a legitimacy to cutting off really otherwise good parents. I work with a lot of these parents in my practice. A lot of them are some of the most dedicated, loving, conscientious parents, you know, of any generation. And their kids get into therapy and they want to talk about their anxiety disorders or their depression, et cetera, which may have resulted from the parents' behavior, but might not have either. And if it hasn't, then a therapist is doing an enormous disservice to those children by making it seem like the reason that the adult child has the issues that they have are because of the parents' bad behavior, and B, greenlighting and estrangement. So my field actually does enormous harm, and that's why I have this new training program with actually an estranged adult child. She's not a child, she's 38 or something, Becca Bland, who's in the UK. And so we call our group Standing Together because we want to train therapists and clergy and coaches to work with this population. And we want to do it, we're allying together because we both have ideas about how to have parents and adult children in dialogue in ways that are much less problematic and much more conducive to healing the distance rather than increasing the distance in a way that I think and know that therapists commonly do. This is my field I'm talking about. So So values is a common, so therapy is a common source of estrangement. You know, genuine abuse or misperception of abuse are sources of estrangement. Differences in values, I talked about political differences. Sometimes there's differences around gender identity, as Columbia sociologist Tay Meadows said in her book, Trans Kids, Being Gendered in the 21st Century. She says atypical gender was once considered a form of psychopathology and a failure of gender. Today it's considered a form of gender. And a lot of parents haven't caught up to the radical reconstruction. Speaking of radical reconstructions, it's happened. This is more in the past few decades. You know, consider, for example, the dating app Tinder lists 37 custom gender options, while Facebook offers 50. So, you know, it's no surprise that some parents are confused when their adult child wants to talk about their new form of gender identity and later get accused of being transphobic if the child wants to switch genders, even if the parent isn't transphobic and just wants to understand it or wants the adult child to be cautious. So I'm seeing more and more of those kinds of cases in my practice as well. Another common source of estrangement is a child's, certainly a parent's mental illness or addictive issues, but a child's mental illness or addictive issues, particularly if they hook up with a therapist who says that the parent caused the child's mental illness. Another very common source of estrangement is when the child marries somebody and that person says, choose me or your parents. You can't choose both. This is a very, very common source of estrangement. In fact, in my survey of 1,600 parents, the vast majority of parents, the estrangement didn't happen until the kid got married or had a child. So it seems clear that the getting married, bringing a new person into a family can be a flashpoint, the potential for estrangement. Another common source of estrangement is actually a defense against worry about the parent or feeling guilty towards the parent. There's a great quote by Andrew Solomon, who wrote the book, Far from the Tree. He says, there's no contradiction between loving somebody and feeling burdened by that person. Indeed, love tends to magnify that burden. And the reason I like that quote so much, well, first of all, it's a beautiful quote, but you know, one of the downsides of all the close, conscientious, careful, anxious, guilt-ridden parenting that we've all been doing for the past 4 decades or so is that sometimes our kids get too much of us. Sometimes estrangement is because they can't get our voice out of their heads. And I've heard more than one adult child say that. I can't get, you know, it's almost always the mom. I can't get my mother's voice out of my head, so I need to go no contact. I need to sort of be able to count on myself. Similarly, one of the downsides of our being so conscientious and interested and caring and concerned is that our children may not learn to they may need to cut the parent off as a way to just feel more themselves, hear their own voice more, feel themselves more. It's what I call lose your parent, find yourself. Now, it doesn't feel good to the parent. It doesn't feel fair to the parent, particularly to the parent who's willing to make amends or hear what the adult child's new requests for boundaries are, etc. But for the adult child, it may be very meaningful and important to do that. So, excuse me. So for the adult child, it's important to know that there are all kinds of upsides to being estranged. There's the idea of separating from the parent, claiming their own voice, their own autonomy, pushing back against figures that they thought rightly or wrongly were abusive or problematic. There's enormous social support for it. There's enormous, there's plenty of forums for estranged adult children to talk about, how cutting the parent off was the best thing they ever did. Don't need the drama, don't need the stress, feeling so much happier. They're supported by therapists and the like. So there's a lot of upsides for the adult child. There's no upside for the parent and the estranged grandparent. It's all downside. It's all shame. It's all loss of one's most important role. It's feeling like you've failed at life's most important role. It's being cut off from the community of other the community of parents and grandparents. It's trying to figure out what to say to people when they ask you, oh, do you have children? Do you have grandchildren? And figuring out what to say to those people. So what does that mean? What it means is that when it comes to negotiations, adult children really have all the power, and parents have very, very little power for the reasons that I just gave. Because for the parent, it isn't really attached to any feeling of happiness or growth or liberation or a community of positive identity and support. So whereas for the adult child, it's attached to all those things. And in general, with negotiations, its basic game theory is, he or she who has the most power and the least to lose is going to carry the day. So what I often tell parents who are about to engage in family therapy with me and their estranged adult child is that, which is really, my favorite kind of work, because I can actually, I love the work in general because I love helping parents who are suffering with this terrible tragedy, particularly having gone through it. I know what it feels like and how good it feels to be on the other side of it. But I love it if I can work with the adult child too, because I'm really in a situation to provide the parent with direct feedback about the ways that they're communicating or behaving, how it's perpetuating the child's worst feelings and the child's needs for more boundaries, which is a very common thing that you hear adult children requesting of their parents today. So what I say, and I'm going to talk for another 15 minutes, and then I'm going to open the floor to questions. But what I often say to parents who are engaging in reconciliation therapy is this is a marriage therapy. Marriage therapy, you come in, your spouse comes in, you talk about what you want, your spouse talks about what they want. You both have equal power to negotiate it, make compromises. Hopefully you walk out closer as a result. Family therapy with an estranged adult child is not like that. Family therapy with an estranged adult child is more like your partner's left, and they're considering maybe they'll not divorce you, but they need you to make a bunch of changes in order to save the marriage, and you have to be willing to do that. And your own desires to have a different kind of relationship is going to have to be secondary to that. Now, my own experience as a family therapist is that it needs to start that way. It doesn't have to end that way. That typically if parents can start there and really show that they can empathize with the adult child's perspective, that they can find the kernel of truth, that even if they don't think that they were emotionally abusive or harmful or traumatizing, that they would say to the adult child that it's clear that I have blind spots, that I don't have that I didn't know that, but I'm really sorry. I know that, you're telling me what your experience was, and I want to understand. We'll talk about that more in a bit, kind of the right things to say and the wrong things to say. So if it's not yet clear, what's required today of today's parent-adult-child relationship is a psychologically much more intensive framework of parents. The following is required: an ability to respond to the adult child's negativity, complaints, criticisms, or rejections in a non-retaliatory way. An ability to disagree with the adult child's values without being rejecting. Say if your kid wants to transition from male to female or female to male, to be able to talk about that in a way that isn't rejecting. A willingness to see that the adult child has their own life separate from that of the parent. To that end, the adult child is not obligated to spend more time than that wanted by the adult child, and more importantly, that the parent's high degree of investment doesn't entitle them to the kind of time that they may feel like they want or deserve or entitled to. It requires of the parent an ability to be sufficiently distant from their own childhood hurts and life wounds or disappointments to recognize that A, their child is not the same person who shaped the parent's identity and wounded them in the first place, and B, the child is not obligated to make up for what the parent hasn't received in their lives. It also requires that the parent learns how to communicate their feelings in a non-critical, non-guilt-inducing, non-shaming way. It also requires the capacity on the parent for some measure of self-reflection. So what I always want parents to understand is that, and this is part of the way that the moral framework has changed, is that from the adult child's perspective, the moral framework is really, is this relationship going to promote my happiness and my personal growth? If so, I might be or am willing to engage or to hear what you have to say. If it's not, then I'm not. And so parents who haven't gotten the memo, and many haven't, are destined to fail with their adult child. So what does it require of the adult child who wants to have a close relationship with a parent? Requires the ability to be close to the parent without fear of losing himself or herself in the relationship. That requires the capacity to be aware of the parent's thoughts, emotions, or needs without feeling unduly influenced to comply with the parent's wishes. This is hugely important because a certain percentage of estrangements happen because the parent is just too powerful in the adult child's eyes. And they're not necessarily too powerful because they were so abusive. They may be too powerful just because they're too important. It's part of what these adult children who say something like, I just need to get my parent's voice out of my head. They feel too much in the parent's presence, like they're losing themselves. They feel pulled off of their own center. This is particularly true of kids who have subtle or overt mental illness. They don't feel sufficiently individuated, separated, to be able to hold on to their own feelings of selfhood and identity in the parent's presence. So for them, estrangement is a form of trying to reclaim that. That's why some adult children not only cut off the parent, they cut off revered grandparents, they cut off other family, they may even cut off family friends because they're trying to find some kernel of selfhood that they can kind of nurture, into a flame because they feel so crowded out by everybody else. Not necessarily because the parent was so, abusive. And that's what's so problematic about this whole therapeutic narrative that we've all become so persuaded by. Sometimes it's love. Sometimes it's investment. Sometimes it's care, concern, worry, guilt, something we Jewish parents have in spades. It also requires of the adult child the ability to state complaints or feedback to the parent without excessive fear of reprisal, even if the parent's prone to that. They have to be strong enough to kind of tell the parent what they like and don't like, and not worry that if the parent doesn't like it, that it's going to be so catastrophic. They have to be able to stand up to the parent. They have to be able to accept the parent's limitations as a parent and as a person. Excuse me. This is critically important. In my survey and in other research and surveys that has been done, there is a very interesting distinction, and that is that when adult children are explaining their complaints about the parent, they put it in terms of the language of character flaws. Well, I estranged myself because the parent's narcissistic, or they're toxic, or they're borderline personality disorder, or something like that. Well, when the parents do it, they put it in terms of context. Well, it's my child's divorce, or it was my divorce, or something else that's more contextual. Now, the problem with putting it in terms of character traits is that this is based on the research of John Gottman, who does a lot of couples research, that when we think about somebody from a perspective of character flaws, we feel much more hopeless about them. If we think about the context of what their behavior, how their behavior originated, we feel more hopeful and more compassionate. So if we just say to some, let's say, put it into marriage therapy, if you say that your spouse is just lazy, you're going to feel more contemptuous and angry at them. If you say that they're tired, or they're overworked, or they're depressed or anxious, you're going to feel more compassionate. Well, similarly, and this is another way that my field of therapy can be more problematic, we're all too eager to give parents diagnoses. If I hear one more parent being wrongly accused of being a narcissistic mother, I'm going to shoot myself in the head. No, I'm not going to do that. I'd be doing it every day. So the ability to accept the parent's limitations as a parent and as a person, I think, is critically important. The ability to recognize that the parent's inability to provide what the child may have wanted or needed was more about the parent's deficits and less about the parent's inherent desire to have the child suffer. When parents do the best they can, and sometimes the best they can is pretty bad, but they don't do it because they want their kids to suffer. They do it because they didn't know any better, because the parenting standards weren't existent when they were raising their children, because they were in a bad marriage, because they were depressed, because they were acting out their own childhood traumas. So it's important that adult children see their parents in a three-dimensional way. And also for the adult child to have some capacity for self-reflection, some ability to see that the way that they contribute to the dynamic. Okay. So to close out, before we get to the Q&A, I'm going to talk about my 10 new rules for parent adult-child relationships. Rule number one, I just went over this, but it's worth going over again. Your child has more power than you do to set the terms of your relationship because they're more willing to walk away. Rule number two, your relationship with your adult child has to occur in an environment of creating happiness and personal growth, not an environment of obligation, emotional debt, or duty. For the longest time, I've wanted to write an article called "The Last Jewish Mother," because in our generation, my generation, you get your Jewish mother guilt tripping you was just part of the culture. What, you can't call your mother more often? Somebody, get a hold of your phone and take it away from you. So today you can't do that. At least with a kid who's estranged or semi-estranged. If you guilt trip your kid, then you're being too intrusive or controlling or interfering with their happiness and limiting their growth. Rule number three, you're not the only authority as a parent on how well you performed as a parent. Your adult child gets to have their own narrative and opinions about the past. Rule number four, related to rule number two, use of guilt trips and criticism won't ever get you what you want from your adult child, especially if you're estranged. Rule number five, learning to communicate in a way that's egalitarian, psychological, and self-aware is essential to a good relationship with your adult child. Egalitarian simply meaning that you and your adult child are equal, that you can't sort of pull the "I'm your parent" card, you need to respect me and my authority. No, people, that ship has sailed. It will take you onto the reefs if you still try to be powered by that ship. I sort of played that analogy out as far as I could, didn't I? Number six, you were the parent when you were raising your child, and you're the parent until they die. You brought your child into this world. That means if your child is unable to take the high road, you still have to. If reconciliation is your goal, I guess you can do whatever you want. I would still argue that it's incumbent on us as parents to take the high road. Rule number seven, a large financial and emotional investment in our child does not entitle us to more contact or affection than is wanted by them, however unjust that may seem. A lot of the parents in my practice have given their children things nobody ever gave them. And so when these parents get estranged, they want to talk about their bad childhoods. A lot of parents say to me, "You had a bad childhood?" I had a bad childhood. I had a bad childhood. Alcoholic father, neglectful mother, abusive siblings. Your child was a freaking walk in the park. It doesn't really work for them to say that to their adult child if reconciliation is their goal. But again, it shows this huge disparity in the way that people are weighing their childhoods and their past. Rule number eight, criticizing your child's spouse, romantic partner, or therapist greatly increases your risk of estrangement. Rule number nine, criticizing your child's sexuality or gender identity greatly increases your risk of estrangement. Rule number 10, just because you had a bad child and did a better job than your parents did, doesn't mean that your child has to accept all the ways that they felt hurt by you, even if that wasn't your intention. All right, well, that completes the lecture portion of this evening. Hope that was helpful. And now we will turn to the Q&A.
Thank you so much. There was so many gems that you provided us with. I couldn't help thinking when you were talking, especially about the stereotype of Jewish moms, which is a stereotype. We have,
of course.
But I do remember in preparation for a bat mitzvah, when my child's school had a meeting with all the bar mitzvah families and said these words. They said, the parent-child relationship is the only love relationship whose success depends on separation. And there was a gasp in the room. Just people's hearts stopped. But interestingly, the bar mitzvah ceremony is about publicly acknowledging that the child is now a Jewish adult. And you have other traditions, Native American traditions, where you send your child at puberty out alone into the woods with only a blanket knitted together by the mother. And we had a visitor once from representing Sikhism who said that in Sikhism, attachment is one of the greatest sins, even attachment to your children. Your children are not your own. So we have in many of our traditions this idea that we're supposed to expect separation. So I'm going to turn to a number of the questions here. Along those lines, we have the question, I've heard you say that one reason a child might cut off contact is if they've been close to the parent and don't know any other way to separate. You've talked about that. Can't get the voice out of the head. In this situation, does the parent just need to wait for the adult child to develop their own voice, or is there anything a parent can do? You boldly put on the cover of your book, How to Heal the Conflict. So what can a parent do?
Well, they have to communicate. A lot of what's helpful is to not do the wrong things. So what they shouldn't do is guilt trip the child, act too hard, act too hurt, act resentful, remind the adult child of what they owe them, tell the adult child that they need to hurry up and get over it or get over themselves. Not doing any of those things is going to be really helpful. So the other thing you can do is to tell the child that you accept that and accept them. What I always do, one of the big parts of my strategies is to help parents write a letter of amends. And in my survey of 1,600 parents, a large percentage of parents who had had a successful reconciliation said that the letter of amends was part of it. And in the letter of amends, the parent is supposed to acknowledge the mistakes that they made, find the kernel of truth. But the other thing that I tell parents to say is, I know you wouldn't cut off contact with me unless it was the healthiest thing for you to do. Now, that's a very hard thing for many parents to write, because from the parent's perspective, it isn't the healthiest thing for them to do. It's a really hurtful thing for them to do. And the parent always feels like, well, there's a better way, particularly if the parent's willing to work on the relationship. But from the adult child's perspective, saying it's the healthiest thing for you to do puts it into the context of growth and happiness. And that really is the moral framework that the adult child is operating in. So it really helps the adult child to feel seen and heard, and to say, take whatever time you need. And if there are things, this is another common thing, if there are things that you need me to work on in the interim, I'm happy to do that. So why do I use the phrase work on? So that's also part of this framework of personal growth and happiness that younger generations, millennials and Gen Z kids are very preoccupied with. So if you use that language, you also gain more credibility.
So you talked about not vilifying a spouse, but you also mentioned a therapist. What about if you know that the adult child's therapist is supporting a narrative that vilifies the parent? And there's a specific question here about the concept of the mother wound. If you can say a little bit about that someone talked about that being a narrative that their child's therapist has introduced.
Well, you have very little authority to criticize somebody's therapist. And frankly, if you do, you're going to put yourself onto a worse path with your adult child. So you're far better off taking the therapist's authority and kind of accepting it. So what will commonly happen in my practice is a parent will say, well, my adult child wrote me a letter, said that they've learned from their therapist that I'm a narcissist, and they sent me some website, etc. Now, of course, what the parent wants to do is say, look, I'm not a narcissist. I've been in therapy for years. Nobody ever called me a narcissist. And I think they whatever. To really persuade the kid about why they're not a narcissist and why the therapist should have their license revoked. Far better to say, I hadn't really thought of myself that way. It's certainly possible that I am. Are there things that you would like me to read in order to learn more about it? And you sort of want to get them off of the narcissist label and onto the behaviors. What behaviors in particular do you find problematic in a relationship? What would you like me to work on in my own therapy? Are you open to going into family therapy with me so that we can work on this together? So I think that's the best way to do it.
Thank you. I remember learning when training to be a rabbi, some of the things, how we talk to our students, and that saying you're proud of someone when they do a good job still keeps you in a role above them. Mm-hmm. But if you say, I'm impressed with what you've done, then you've elevated them. So as long as you say you're proud, even though that's positive, you're still over them. So there's so much subtlety in language, and it's so hard to walk on eggshells, So there's also the question going even further, not just vilifying, but the question of a false allegation of physical abuse. So one One member mentioned in the chat an adult child who wants to just put it all behind him and move forward with some communication with the estranged parent, but the estranged parent still feels deeply maligned because of this accusation. So do you just humble yourself and say, I understand this is your experience? What do you do?
Yeah, well, you have to find some way to be on the same page. So it's trickier if the false allegation is sexual abuse. And I have seen increasing number of parents who are in my practice. They'll say, "Look, and some of them have, gone to the police and said, "Give me a lie detector test, and evaluate me." And in numerous cases, they've been proven innocent. But those are really, really tricky cases. So commonly with something like that, what I will tell parents to say is, look, there's just, I can tell with 100% authority that I'm not capable of sexually abusing any child, especially my own. But then you have to pivot back to their experience, because defensiveness will just make them defensive. You can say, but I also know that sometimes people remember certain things, have particular kinds of memories because they're trying to uncover other parts of the relationship that didn't feel good. And I just want you to know that I'm happy to talk about that. Or if you want to see a specialist with me, just, hope that they really are. Now, the kid the parent is being accused of physical abuse, that's a little bit less, it's a little less problematic to admit to physical abuse than sexual abuse for a variety of reasons. I still don't think he should admit to something that he didn't do. I think a parent could credibly say something like, look, I have no memory of that. I guess it's possible that I did and don't recall it. I don't think that's the case. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing I would forget, but I guess theoretically it's possible. So, if that happened, of course you'd be furious at me and want me to repair. So, we're in these situations are the trickiest, but we want to sort of find these bridging comments. That's why I like the comment where if a parent's being accused of emotional abuse or harm or neglect, to say that it's clear that I have significant blind spots that I wasn't aware that you felt that way. Because sometimes these things are completely, they're revisionist history on the part of the adult child, but the parent's never going to get anywhere that way. And let me just say one thing, because I forgot to say it in my lecture that's so important, and that is the role of divorce is probably one of the most common pathways to estrangement. Divorce can cause one parent to poison one child against the other parent. The child independently could ally with one parent against the other parent. It brings new people into the child's life that they can, want to ally, who they feel threatened by in terms of the emotional, psychological resources, for a bunch of other reasons. Something like 70% of the people in my practice who are estranged have been through a divorce. So I just wanted to make sure I got that on the table today.
And that's where we talk about parental alienation.
Right. Yeah.
I've been through a divorce and have counseled a number of congregants around divorce. And one of the things I always tell people is, whatever you say negative about your ex to your child, it's like a rubber bullet in a room with no windows or doors, that eventually whatever you say will come back to you. Yeah. And we see that often. We have a comment here also about ultimatums. If a child, and you talked about how really it's the child who holds so much power here. If a child issues an ultimatum that they know is contrary to the parent's moral compass, if you don't do this, you will never see me again. How much does a parent need to humble themselves, even if it goes against their own values?
It's really up to the parent. I have parents in my practice who say, well, I'm just not willing to go that far, and other parents will say, I'm just going to assume this is what my kids need, and I don't agree with them or like it, but if it gives me access to my adult child and my grandchild, then I'll do whatever is necessary. And I think it's really up to the parent to make that call. I don't think it's a right or wrong thing. I think it's more what can people tolerate.
One of the most painful things I saw in the chat was somebody just simply said, how do I live like this? And said that they haven't spoken, they've been estranged for 6 years, I think was what was written. And so what do you say to just that desperate plea for help? How do I live like this with this kind of grief, which is different than the grief when someone, God forbid, dies? Or is there a comparison with that kind of grief?
Well, I mean, I would argue in some ways it's easier than when a child dies. I haven't had a child die, so I really have no business saying that. But I've had other estranged parents in my practice who had a child die and a child estrange themselves. Because when a child dies, there's all kinds of social support around it. There's no feeling of shame. It's a very clear end. You don't really typically blame yourself for it in the same way. Whereas if when your kid estranges yourself, this is particularly true for mothers, and I haven't really seen the whole audience here, but I bet it's 90% moms. It's very hard for mothers to feel like they shouldn't be doing something more. Moms typically feel like there's gotta be something else that I could be doing, something else that I should be doing. So in terms of tolerating the pain, there's a few principles that I think are really important. One is learning how to make the distinction between pain and suffering. If we're going through an estrangement, we're going to experience pain. There's no way around that. You're going to see a grandmother push her granddaughter down the street, you're going to feel pain. You're going to, look at a picture of your child when they were young and feel pain. You're going to read a book, you're going to see a movie, you can have a dream where you're reconciled and you're going to feel pain. There's nothing I can do to prevent that. That's different than suffering. Suffering is all the mental processes that we go through ostensibly to help us with the pain, but actually end up tying us to the pain. There are things like catastrophizing. How can I ever live, if I never see my child again? Or I can't live if I never see my child again. Or this means I'm a terrible person. Or, social isolation, guilt tripping yourself, getting mad at yourself. All those things are mental processes that we can learn over time to get more and more control over. Mindfulness meditation is actually a really good way to do that, because it enables us to really track our thoughts and our feelings and learn to become detached over and over again. And another principle, and I have an article about this coming out in Aeon magazine next month, mid-month, on radical acceptance, which is such a powerful principle, which is this idea that you just have to accept it in all its terrible, presentation. Like when my daughter was estranged from me, I would, daily wake up thinking, how am I going to live with this kind of heartache? And one day, a voice in my head said, you know what? You may never see your kid again. You're just going to have to accept that. And it was oddly kind of reassuring. So that's radical acceptance. There's a saying by Marsha Linehan, who's the founder of dialectical behavior therapy, where she says, the path out of hell is through misery. The more that we fight our misery, the more we're going to remain in hell. So we have to start by accepting where we are in that moment. And the more that we struggle against that, the worse we're going to feel.
That's so powerful. Thank you.
Yeah.
In terms of creating a relationship, or returning to relationships slowly, one person wrote how afraid they are, that they want it, but they're also afraid of having a relationship. And also there was a comment that my estranged child had hip surgery at 31 years old. I sent flowers and she responded with a thank you. So now what? Right. So you are scared to say too much, right? Is there some sort of pathway one follows of just being careful?
Yeah, there's sort of it like when I work with parents, one of the things that I give to them is a diagnosis and a strategy. So really it depends on what the adult child's working on. So if it's a child who, said to the parent, I want to go no contact, the strategy may be that you just respect that for a year and don't contact them, because the child may respect you more for it, for not continuing to, throw good energy after bad. They may feel like you're respecting their wishes more. They may miss you more. You may be making them less defensive by going no contact. So sometimes that's the right thing to do. Whereas sometimes it's useful to just send out something kind of chatty every month or every other month or so. Just it's a way of kind of saying, I'm still here, I'm not mad, the door's open and the like. But if your kid's been estranged and they send you a thank you, I consider that a good thing. But the feeling of walking on eggshells, particularly early in a reconciliation, is incredibly common.
I love what you shared about, at some point freeing yourself as a parent. And
Yes.
I heard a story. I have a colleague, a rabbi, who prayed for a child and was struggling with infertility. And after everyone left the synagogue every day, she would kneel in front of the ark and pray with all of her heart. And she said that one day God answered her prayers, and the answer was no.
Wow.
And that it was it was freeing for her at that moment
Yeah.
when she finally came to terms that she was not going to carry her own child, and that she was going to then choose different paths. So we have a question also about technology. You talk about the modern age, and what role does technology play? I know that, there's a saying that comparison is the thief of joy, right? Always, and everyone presents their perfect families online. And does that contribute to dissatisfaction with our own families?
Well, there's no question, particularly if you're estranged. First of all, you might be able to have this window into your child's life, with their Facebook. So maybe you're not blocked and you can see them celebrating, the holidays with, their in-laws, and and the in-laws have replaced you as the primary parents, and maybe, the father-in-law walked your daughter down the aisle at the wedding or is attending the bat mitzvah, that kind of thing. So social media really enlarges the range of feeling ashamed and left out and excluded. And social media can be vicious. I work with parents whose adult children are blogging about them and how they're toxic mothers and fathers and narcissistic parents and borderline parents. And, it's bad. In the old days before all this, would be bad enough to just not to be out of contact with your kid, but to be humiliated like that in these very public forums where other people are joining in and going, oh yeah, that your mom sounds like a total narcissist. I think you did the total right thing, even though they never even met them. So I think it's a huge problem, that whatever benefits there are for those who aren't faced it are not outweighed by those who are, facing this.
We have a question about adoption. Do you see more cases of alienation with adoption, or?
I do. Yeah. I don't have statistics yet, but I'm seeing so many that I'm probably going to do a study on it. So I do think it's common, but I don't have statistics. I don't know. I know that I do have some statistics on kids who transition gender from male to female or female to male. And there's a fairly high rate of estrangement in that population. So.
And silence. Someone asks about silence as well. Just when everything you do is met with silence. I mean, that's what you've been talking about all along, just how painful that is.
Yeah, I think, there's a number of different conditions where I think parents should stop drawing. So my typical method is you write a really good amends letter. And if you're interested in this, I have, regular webinars on this topic. And I talk about it in my book because it's such an important way to get on the same page with your adult child. A lot of these adult children, I hope I haven't sounded like I'm being overly or unfairly critical of them, because a lot of them really want a better relationship with the parent. They just want the parent to change and to do things differently. And often the requests of the parent aren't unreasonable. It's just that the parent doesn't have the kind of framework to know how to talk to them about it. And an amends letter is the best way to do that. So what I commonly tell parents is you write a really good amends letter where you take responsibility, you find the kernel of truth, you show compassion, you don't offend, you don't explain. And then if you get nothing back, you wait 6 to 8 weeks, you do a follow-up letter where you say, just checking in with you, wanted to see if you had a chance to look at my letter. I'm sure there were things in the letter that I left out that would be useful to have included, but I just wanted to get a conversation started. And then if you get nothing, then I wouldn't do anything probably for at least a few months, then I might send a checking in with you. But if you get nothing for a year after that, then it may mean it's time to let the line go cold for at least a year. Now, I like a year because it's a very definitive period of time and it's useful to have a concrete period of time. But also I like it because at the end of the year, the parent can write the adult child and say, it was clear that my reaching out wasn't helpful to you. I wanted to give you some time, without being in contact, just checking in with you to see if you're open to resuming contact or having a dialogue or being in family therapy and the like. So that's the condition. If you're getting restraining letters sent to you, getting threatened by the police calling you, your kid gets enraged every time you call them, it just means things are too inflamed and you just need to stop.
I wonder, listening to you, I'm almost thinking that I wonder if a psychological shift into thinking about one's child as a business relationship, in that, when the customer's always right, right. And I mean, if a congregant, comes yelling at the temple, it's different than if a family member does, right? There's a lot of love there.
Right, right.
And at the same time, we want to do everything we can to make sure that person feels heard.
Yeah.
Just recently I was accused by a congregant of dismissing their pain when they told me that they were getting divorced. And my first thought was, can't possibly have been what I did, because I care so much about that. How is that? But obviously that's what this person heard. And
Right.
if it had been a family member, it might have been harder to be, magnanimous about it, right? Being misunderstood.
Sure.
But in a business relationship, or a contractual relationship, it's very different.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a good point. I have a webinar called The 5 Most Common Mistakes of Estranged Parents. And the first one is thinking that your relationship should be based on fairness rather than strategy or practicality. So it sort of gets to what you're saying, Rabbi, that you really want to be strategic if your goal is reconciliation, because if you're preoccupied with what's fair, your kid's never going to listen to you. They're just going to feel guilt-tripped and shamed and criticized.
So on the idea of the amends letter, I think the amends letter is amazing. That's an amazing tool, and also can go very wrong as well, because you have to be so careful. Probably really need other eyes to read it and give their feedback before it's sent. We have someone mentioning, what if the son-in-law is gatekeeping the mail, and is there something you say in the amends letter to get past whoever is gatekeeping? And also, maybe you have no way to send an amends letter. There's really no contact or email.
Yeah, well, those are the most tragic. The kid has gone so far underground. They've cut off text, they've cut off email, parents are blocked on social media. Maybe they don't even have an address. I mean, in those situations, I probably would counsel the parent to just pull back for a significant period of time, because when a child is making it that hard to be found or discovered, it probably means they really don't want to be found or discovered, and anything the parent does to move in their direction is probably going to push them away further. But to get to the issue of the gatekeeper, son-in-law, or daughter-in-law, which is incredibly common, what I recommend is if you think your son-in-law or daughter-in-law is the gatekeeper, that you write your amends letter to them. And part of the reason that you're doing it, obviously there's the hope that they'll relent. Some do, many don't, particularly if they're really troubled, as some of these people are. But even if they don't relent, you're doing it for the audience of your adult child, because sometimes, sons in particular are very conflict avoidant. And if they're married to somebody who's just going to make their lives miserable, they're just going to go, you know what, I love my parents, but I can't deal with the backlash from my wife or my spouse if I'm in contact with my parents. And so if the parents really write a really good amends letter to the estranged gatekeeping son-in-law or daughter-in-law, then that adult child is in a better position to say, look, I think my parents are really trying. These letters are hard to write. They're taking responsibility. So that's really part of the goal of doing it that way.
So if you are planning to watch Breaking Bad and you haven't seen the ending, this is a spoiler alert, so cover your ears. But at the end of Breaking Bad, right, when everything goes to hell, his child won't accept money from him because he's become so bad. He arranges it so that when he turns a certain age, there'll be this money that comes. Okay. And I'm just thinking, when you have absolutely no way to contact your adult child, what about keeping a journal or a collection of letters to the grandchildren that somehow they can see them when they are adults, when they're in their 20s, just in terms of the wanting to protect your own legacy as a loving person and wanting your prodigy your descendants to know you and know your story, not to attack their parents, but just legacy, right? Ethical will. Do you recommend keeping a journal for grandchildren or great grandchildren?
Yeah, I do. And I really like that idea and do counsel parents to do that. It's very much as you said, or even to get gifts, at each age and keep them like in a box. that you give to the, that you leave in your will. And just be careful not to say anything critical about the parent or parents in the will. I also believe, and I wrote an article about this for MarketWatch, I don't think that estranged parents should cut their estranged adult children out of their wills. I think they should basically leave the same amount that they would leave for their non-estranged children, which, I know it's a big ask, but partly it's, what do you want your legacy to be? A. B, all the ways that adult children can become estranged, is it really their fault? If you're married to somebody who's a gatekeeper and won't let you see your parents, is it really that person's fault that they're not strong enough? If your kid has mental illness, is it their fault that they're not strong enough? If the only way they know how to feel separate from you is to estrange you, is that their fault? For a divorce where they've been successfully brainwashed against you. I think cutting a kid out of a will is such a final act and it's such a rejecting act that I typically counsel parents not to do it. Now, some parents go, well, too bad, I'm doing it anyway. But in terms of where, I want to draw my line in the sand, it's my counsel for parents.
First we have a question. Do you do family counseling by Zoom? There are some people who are interested, who are not you're in San Francisco, right?
Yeah.
In the Bay Area. And also you recommend the same idea of amends letters between siblings as well. There's different types of estrangement in families. And there's a wonderful book. I don't know if you read the book by Lori Gottlieb, who has been a member at Temple Isaiah, and she talks. You need to talk to someone or talk to someone.
Maybe you should talk to someone.
Maybe you should talk to someone. And one of the storylines that she follows is of an elderly woman who's estranged from her children. And it's not an amends letter at the end that she writes that actually is a little bit of a breakthrough, but it's really when she decides to move on with her own life and pursue new relationships. And it is amends. She says she's sorry to her children, but she also says at this point, I can't chase anymore, and I love you and I'm here, but I met someone and and I just think that was an interesting, at what point do you start? Somebody wrote here that I'm very much circulating in, they're circulating in their own world with the death of their father, the children moving away. So difficult. There was somebody who had asked about the concept of the mother wound, and I don't think that we addressed that. Do you know what that is in therapy?
I don't enough to speak authoritatively about it, so I don't think I should comment on it. Sorry.
Then there's a comment for Mother's Day. I was gifted something called Storyworth. Every week, my eldest daughter, who I'm not estranged from, sends me a question to answer about me. You can also just journal. At the end of 1 year, a hardcover book is generated and presented to the requesting child. So it's a nice idea just to find ways to tell your story.
Yeah, no, I like that. Well, I also want to circle back to the point you were making before, Rabbi, which is that, because in terms of what Lori was saying, I really encourage parents, moms in particular, to reclaim not only your life, but your identity as a parent. That our adult children should not be the ultimate authority about what kind of parents we were. I mean, part of the reason I like amends letters is that they're therapeutic, because it's therapeutic to say, yeah, these are the ways that I failed you and let you down. They're not easy letters to write, but it's part of the radical acceptance method. But once you've done that, then you really want to move towards self-love, self-acceptance, self-compassion, and also letting go. If you've written the amends letter and you've tried and you've taken responsibility and you've shown resilience, then you need to feel psychologically, say to your child, internally, I wouldn't recommend saying this to the child, but psychologically, you need to feel like, sweetheart, I've done everything that I can. It's now on you. There's nothing else I can do. Part of being an adult is accepting people's apologies. If you can't, then okay. But, maybe I need to shut down the chamber of my heart with your name on it, but I need to live my life, and I'm not going to let this estrangement ruin it, because it's so easy for moms in particular to let an estrangement just be a complete blight on their life. And your child doesn't deserve that. As precious as your child is, as wonderful as they are, as much as you cherish them, they don't deserve to ruin your life. So you really have to be self-protective in that regard.
You can still be a good parent, have been a good parent.
Exactly. Well, I would say that most of the parents who have estranged themselves were good parents, and even the ones who made monumental mistakes still deserve love and
I mean,
compassion.
we all know how shocking it is when they send you home from the hospital with that newborn and you're like, do I have to sign something? Like, you're letting me? Do you even know? And all the learning that we have to do along the way. My grandmother was fairly abusive, physically abusive and emotionally abusive to my mother. And at my grandmother's funeral, there was no estrangement. And at my grandmother's funeral, my mother stood up and said, "I want to thank my mother for giving me life." And I think in a way that was the key to her acceptance of her mother, that despite everything, and this was a very troubled, my grandmother was a very troubled person, despite everything, to have been able to find that gratitude. I wanted to just say that the power that happens, I really empathize with so many of the comments when they talk about the therapist, and the power that the therapist has. I've seen that myself with having different therapists, and some who really focus on the tiniest story that you tell and try to amplify it.
Exactly.
And it's hard not to be influenced by that.
Well, particularly if you come into adulthood with some feeling of shame and effectiveness, because so many of the parents in my practice, their kids have some subtle or form of mental illness, and they may have been very close to the parent, and then they get into therapy, and they're doing this, they're looking back on their childhoods and they're saying, well, if you hadn't done X, Y, or Z, I wouldn't have had anxiety as a child, I wouldn't have had school refusal, and I wouldn't have had separation anxiety or depression, and I would have done better. And, often that's really not the case. And it's problematic in two ways. One is that it's wrong in terms of just theoretically incorrect in terms of making these linkages. We become so preoccupied with trauma as the creation of self, but it's also done in this kind of moral framework of, well, if your parents made mistakes, you don't owe them anything. That's kind of the language that these letters that I see from adult child. Well, you did this and you did that, so I don't want to have a relationship with you. It's kind of like, well, it's just to me a very problematic way to run it.
I'm also looking at it from a spiritual perspective. From my role, is that maybe there's also just exercising trust. I once saw a Facebook post from a congregant after their mother died, and they wrote, I am so sorry that it took me this long to really see the love that you were trying to give me. And it was after her mother had died. And I wonder if there's a way to exercise our own trust that somehow our own stories and our own love will be recognized, and we might not glean the comfort from it directly, but just wondering about that. There are questions about support groups, and Gail Gottesman mentioned that you have a Facebook support group. How do people get to know what kind of support groups they could join with you?
Yes, on mine, you can find it on my website. I don't know if that link is in the chat box, Rabbi. Okay. So it's a private.
I'll put it in again.
Okay, you have to answer 3 questions just because we want to make sure it's just for estranged parents and grandparents. It's a very, very supportive group. So there's that group. I'm sure there's plenty of other ones, but that's the one that I run. So.
And then I do see one other question here about, and all of these questions deserve so much time. Right. So really appreciate and am amazed at the sharing. I think allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and tell our own stories is so important and healing and helpful. So one person writes, my oldest daughter goes off and on estrangement and then influences her younger and older sisters. My oldest daughter tells me how to respond, how to act, what to say. What can I say to set a boundary on the estrangement roller coaster?
Well, I mean, I guess the question is whether or not the daughter is giving you good advice or bad advice. She may be giving you bad advice that's hard to take, or she may be giving you advice that's not really, tied to what the other siblings are doing. I mean, the question is always with when kids are doing this is, sometimes adult children need to be estranged for all the reasons that I've given. And so that's why I want parents to feel like if they've done everything kind of right, at least by what I think is right, then you need to feel like, okay, you've done everything that you can do or need to do. But sometimes there are problems in our communication, how we're being, subtle ways or overt ways we're not being respectful of their boundaries. So it really depends on whether the child's inability to stay in contact has more to do with their inability to kind of hold on to themselves, or it's really a problem in the communication. If it's a problem in the communication, then you do want to pay attention to how you're communicating and how you're behaving and being oriented to changing that.
So everybody wants to know those magic words that either open the door, with a child, or open the door with the gatekeeper. And it sounds like you've tried to answer that question. I think one of the tropes that I heard over and over again from you is this asking, what else, what would you like me to do? What can I read? What can I do? Which is a humbling and a willingness to listen, to empathize, and to change.
Yeah, I think that's really the most critically important part. If your kid really is open to changing and really does want a different relationship with you and is really ready to do that, is to be open and responsive and self-reflective. Because part of it, regardless, your goal in communicating is to help them to not be defensive. So whatever you say or do, the goal is really to lessen the chance of a defensive response. So the more, that's why when I say something like, well, it's clear I have blind spots, instead of saying, what, you're rewriting history. Just last year you told me I was the best, parent ever. Now you're saying, you were so traumatized. Give me a break. So that's not going to work. It's just going to make your kid feel defensive. If you say, well, I guess I had blind spots. I wasn't aware that you felt that way. I'm glad you did. That invites much more self-reflection from your child. So that's really the primary orientation that I think is the most useful.
I think one of the things also is we all, and this may be an American, you talked about our culture and how it fosters this kind of estrangement and individualism.
Yeah.
And this idea that everyone wants to be someone and have a story. And you see people becoming famous on TikTok and Instagram because they have an interesting story. And so we build our myths around ourselves. And maybe our myth is that we were abused, or that we're adult orphans, or that we,
Absolutely.
Just like in Walt Disney, the mother is always the bad, someone bad, or has abandoned you. And I think we get addicted to our own myth. And it must be so difficult to try to change the story that you tell yourself, the longer the estrangement goes on. If it's, you haven't spoken to your parents in years, how to slowly rewrite a story after you've worked so hard to defend this one.
No, I think that's really true. And I think you're raising a really important point that estrangement becomes its own kind of identity, and virtue signaling, that being abused and traumatized, you're kind of inviting a certain kind of empathy and support from people, and a membership in a certain kind of a community that can be very compelling and addictive and attractive. So, I don't think anybody changes anybody's narrative any more than we can sort of change somebody's political beliefs. So that's why the more we can be self-reflective and not be defensive and not invite defensiveness on the other person's part, then there's a bigger probability, because I have seen parents, sometimes adult children come into the conversation, with guns blazing, and if the adult child and the parent doesn't fire back and just, is receptive and interested, then the adult child has to think, well, wait, is that really how I think and feel? And that's why sometimes, having just time apart can be useful, because then the adult child has to think, okay, well, my parent hasn't contacted me. Why aren't they contacting me? Well, I did say I wanted to be in no contact. Do I really want to be in no contact? So those are really the goals, is to sort of change the environment, because you can't really change the thinking directly, typically.
So we're nearing the end of our 90 minutes with you. And we did have somebody say, is there a way to encourage your adult child's therapist to take your therapist training? That would be amazing, right? I wonder if you could send, this is my probably not so above board advice on this, which is that maybe you could send like an anonymous, like, you want a free gift, right? You want a free training, no return address. Just hope that they attend it.
Great idea, actually. I love that idea. I'm going to start.
Right. Have a calligrapher just write it all up, make it look really legit. Use a QR code. I don't know.
I love that.
But I really want to thank you for your time. And the last thing I just want to ask in our last couple minutes is, as we're emerging from this pandemic and the country is starting to open up again, are there any opportunities that are particular to right now that we might, grab onto?
Well, I've been encouraging parents to just reach out, kind of briefly checking in on you, making sure you or my grandchildren are okay. Kind of short, sweet. You get in and you get out. It's kind of just way of, sometimes just the lightest touch is the best way. And I've had some success with adult children reaching back out and it kind of rekindling some contact. Not always, but sometimes that can be useful. So yeah, in general, the lighter the touch, the better it's going to be received. And I forgot to mention, Rabbi, that if people do want to buy my book, which again is very subtly displayed behind me, I'm going to donate back a portion to the temple. So as a thank you gift to the rabbi and the temple.
Thank you. That means so much. Thank you very much. I'm also just putting my email in the chat again. We will have a recording of this available if you wanted to rewatch and take notes or share. So you can email me if you're not a congregant and you're looking to get a copy. I'd be happy to share that with you. I know that Dr. Coleman's book is really worthwhile. It's the kind of book that you're going to want to read with a highlighter so that you can remember passages that are really meaningful. So thank you so much. I know we could talk to you for hours and hours. I have a feeling some of the folks here will be reaching out to you. And I'm so grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you, everybody who showed up.
Thank you so much, Josh and Rabbi Zoe. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Switch to gallery mode in our last minute if you want to just wave at friendly faces.
That's a good idea.
So,
We had a lot of people show up. 200, how much did you say? 260 registered?
we had 260 registered. So that just shows how many people are
Oh my God.
wrestling with this subject.
Wow.
with
Wow.
Their families.
That's a lot. Yeah.
No, I was this is the parking lot conversation. I once learned that America is, I think, the only country, and this could be, I don't know if this is an exaggeration, but where we don't celebrate going into your parents' business. Every other country, you go into your father's business, there's a family business, but in America, we pride ourselves on making it on our own and starting from scratch. And nowhere else is that a value.
I think that's a really interesting point. There was a really good book by a sociologist at University of Massachusetts, Amy Shallett, called Not Under My Roof. And it was a book about, she's Dutch, and she compared Dutch parenting practices versus American parenting practices. And the Dutch will allow their teenagers, starting around the age of 16 or 17, to have sleepovers with boyfriends or girlfriends and have alcohol at the dinner table. And it's part of just the culture. Whereas Americans would, and she calls it interpersonal individualism, the idea that they become individuals. So they have a highly individualistic culture too, but it's in the context of kind of a parental relationship. Whereas in America, we're very, what she calls it, adversarial individualism, which I think is such a great concept. The idea you become an individual through an adversarial relationship with your parent by defying them and doing rebellious things and the like. And so I think it's very much to your point, Rabbi, that it's all about separation and individuation. And we in my field lionize those concepts in ways that are really problematic and hurtful and confusing to younger people.
Well, Thank you so much. Someone wrote, thank you for the help and hope. And that really is what you're giving people. And so we're so grateful, all of us.
Thank you.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it. It was
I've learned a
fun.
lot.
Good. I'm so glad. It was great. Great. A lot of great questions.
Good evening, everyone. Have
Good
a
morning.
very nice long weekend.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.